Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine and... Oh, hang on.
I quit. And I know it is a face-up machine. You're just keeping a secret from me.
That hasn't happened before.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, release stories, distribution stories, all the ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how difficult it is to get a film off the ground. I'm going to get on straight away with a particular comedy favourite of mine. Let's go to 2015. I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer and I'll come to the story of this particular film right after this.
Tell me where the bomb is. 10 seconds or you're dead.
Interesting.
I'm the only one who knows where that nuke is. Well, then in that case, I'd say you'd better stop.
Oh my God, why did you do that?
I didn't do it on purpose. There's like a ton of pollen in here.
When I quit teaching and joined the CIA, I thought I was going to be this amazing spy, and I'm still just the same boring person I was.
You play it too safe.
I just hear my mom's voice. Just blend in, let somebody else win. Making a wave isn't always brave.
Brilliant.
Give up on your dreams, Susan. Just to write that in my lunchbox.
We've intercepted chatter that Rayana Boyanov knows where that nuke is. She knows the identity of all our agents. We need someone to find the bomb without being detected, but it can't be any of you. We need someone invisible.
I'll do it.
Okay. Thanks, lunch lady.
I'm serious.
Don't let me down, Cooper.
I will not. I will let you up.
Stop talking.
I will let you up.
And that is a clip from the 2015 action comedy film Spy, written and directed by Paul Feig, and starring Melissa McCarthy, Jason Statham, Rose Byrne, Miranda Hart, Bobby Cannavale, Alison Janney, Jude Law also in the mix there. And so for this one, we sort of have to start with a film that came out in 2006, the James Bond reboot Casino Royale. Paul Feig had grown up being a fan of spy movies, loved the James Bond films as well, but it was a trip to see Casino Royale that kick-started the idea for what would become Spy just under a decade later. And he recalled going to see it. He said, I was like, that's how they should look. It all added up to wanting to do something like that. And he said, I realised that nobody's going to let me do one of those, a James Bond film, but then this is my opportunity to write something for the funny women I like, and I took it from there. A woman who becomes a spy, the brains behind the real spy, everything came together. Now, when Paul Feig went to see Casino Royale, he was in movie jail, self-confessed movie jail at the time, that he had directed a couple of features, none of which had really broken through at all. And so he'd been working on television. The TV series Freaks and Geeks is much loved, not least by me, but that hadn't turned into a big commercial hit to go with its critical love. Likewise, he was working on things like The Office, which was a hit, but there were lots of people also in the midst of working on The Office. So there was nothing really coming through directly in his name, but he was still in conversations regularly with Judd Apatow. And it was Judd Apatow who suggested he take the directorial reins on 2010 film Bridesmaids. Now, when Bridesmaids hit big, and I will come to it on a future episode of the podcast, that's when he had the clout to get his own films moving again. He was out of movie jail, and he decided the next film he made was The Heat, starring Sandra Bullock and Melissa McCarthy, but he decided early on that he wanted to do that spy movie as well. And his approach to doing so was he was going to write a script for a spy film, and then he was going to put the jokes on top of that. What he didn't want to do was a parody. He wanted to do a real spy movie with real stakes, but also for it to be funny. And so in an interview at RogerEbert.com, he talked about while he was in post-production on The Heat, and how he'd just gone to see Skyfall as well, which had reignited his passion for this particular project. He said it really just came out of this thing of what I had the best take on. If I had a great female spy who was trying to figure all this stuff out and who was relatable, and my brain kind of went on fire because I knew how to do that movie. It was no more political beyond that, he pointed out. It was just about all the stuff that I knew I was good at and was excited about doing, a female spy comedy. It was done. And he said, my head suddenly flooded with ideas, and I went to the studio even without the story worked out, and they loved it. Then I wrote it, and it just kind of took on this snowball effect. Now, Feig's production company, FICO, had inked a fresh deal with 20th Century Fox in early 2013 as well, so it was all coming together. But it's worth noting that even though he'd enjoyed successes with Melissa McCarthy in Bridesmaids and The Heat, he didn't write Spy for her. Because as much as he wanted Melissa McCarthy to take on the lead role in the film, at the point Spy was originally going to shoot, it was going to be at the end of 2013, and Melissa McCarthy was double booked at that point. She was committed to making the film Tammy. And so in terms of casting, she was certainly not a shoo-in for the lead role, because Feig, as much as he wanted her, hadn't envisaged that she would be available for it. Of people who were mentioned, I think Zooey Deschanel was mentioned in relation to the film at one point. I'm not sure exactly which role it was in, but her casting wouldn't really pan out. But then Spy would be slightly delayed as well. News nonetheless first landed of the film when it was called Susan Cooper. That was its original name, in June of 2013. This was when Feig was a week or two away from releasing The Heat, and the kind of assumption from those of us reporting on film at this point was if The Heat was a hit, The Heat was a hit, then this would be his next project. But he hadn't found a lead star, yet already at that point it was being described as a realistic comedy about a female James Bond. The script was written. Feig did have another project on the go at that point. He'd done a mother-daughter comedy that he'd scripted with Katie Dippold, who co-written The Heat with him. Dippold and Feig also wrote a sequel for The Heat, which would have been based in and around the idea of the Silence of the Lambs, but Sandra Bullock decided she didn't want to do that, so that never happened as well. But there were an assortment of things that he was juggling at that point. Yet it was in July 2013, it was clear that Susan Cooper was going to be the next film to go, because all of a sudden Melissa McCarthy's availability had opened up, that the schedules now had aligned, and she could indeed take on the role of Susan Cooper in the film. Fox was going to back it. It was going to give it a very quick green light as well. And so then it came to the point of other pieces of casting. For the role of Rick Ford, the experienced spy out in the field, the experienced operative, the studio was assuming that Feig was interested in comedy performers to take that on. But as he told me in an earlier episode of the Film Stories podcast, we did a live event with him in London a year or two back, he had someone else in mind. I'll let him explain why he felt Jason Statham was the right fit.
And Jason's, he makes his living being a cool, tough guy, so it's like at some point I kept thinking, he's going to just say, I can't do that, or just, beat me up. But no, he was just so game to do it because he just had the best time with it. And it's funny, when I wrote that role, because I had a meeting, I was a giant Jason Statham fan forever. My wife and I, just every movie he's in, he's so great. And so I actually, when you're a director and you're actually doing okay, you can have what's called a general meeting with somebody. Go like, I would just like to meet Jason Statham and talk to him. So he comes to my office one day, and I'm so nervous because I'm like, oh my God, because I don't know what to expect. And I'm like, is he going to be really mean? Is he going to be tough? Is he not going to want to talk? And I walk out into the lobby. He's like, hey, Jason. He's like, hey, Paul. And a big smile. And it's just like, oh, he's like a really nice, normal guy. And so I said, I want to write something for you. And so when I wrote, before I did Spy, when I wrote Spy, I wrote it for him. But everybody from the studio would read it and go like, oh, so you're going to cast like Will Ferrell or Ben Stiller or somebody in this role? I said, no, it's Jason Statham. And they thought it was hilarious. I was worried they weren't going to let me do it. But thank God they did, and thank God he did it. So
It had been the film Crank that had put Jason Statham firmly on the radar of Paul Feig, as it did for many of us. I've covered Crank in a previous episode of this podcast. And so what Paul Feig told me once, that it was while watching that first Crank film that made him realise that Statham could also be funny. That, quote, he could play things where he was in on the joke. And Feig described to me how he became obsessed with this idea. He said, I have to put him in a comedy, but it took years to figure out what it was. And he said, when I was writing this, I thought I need this kind of testosterone-laden rival spy for her. This is it. Finally, I can write something for Statham. And so I put it together for him, but then thought, he'll never do it, will he? Well, I put that question to Jason Statham once, a sentence I do not say lightly, and he said, as you know, I'm always apprehensive to look like an idiot. I could do it in a Statham voice, really. I know I should, but you'll just have to imagine. And he said some comedies, they want you falling on your face and doing silly things. But he explained Paul Feig had a great idea that he wasn't going to make a spoof or a barefaced silly comedy. He wanted to do a sophisticated spy thriller. The situations that would be happening in the story would be funny. And so Statham was interested. Took him a while to say yes. He was first linked to it in October 2013. He wouldn't actually sign on the dotted line for several months, but crucially, he would sign on the dotted line. And then the casting continued. It's clear it wasn't going to shoot at the end of 2013 anymore. And in fact, the casting news was coming through into 2014. Rose Byrne was cast towards the end of 2013, but then other people were coming in early the following year. I mean, you get names like Alison Janney, 50 Cent, you get Jude Law, Peter Seranovitz, also all joining the ensemble. But the casting of Rose Byrne was really important in particular because that led to changes in the script as well. And as Paul Feig explained to RogerEbert.com, he said, I had her and Melissa come in months before and had them just start reading the scenes. And Rose Byrne was doing a variation of what I'd written and it just wasn't right for her or anything. And so Feig explained, we tried different things, danced around it, then she started using an English accent and she started doing the insults. There were insults in the script, but she started doing them in this English accent in a matter-of-fact way. And it was so funny that I figured out the dynamic and went back to rewrite the script to accommodate that. The last piece of the filming jigsaw was Miranda Hart. She would sign up in March of 2014 and it was time to go. That filming would begin at the end of that month in Budapest. It would run for 55 days in the end. Now, because he was shooting in Europe, Paul Feig could move to French hours for the production. That he'd been shooting his previous films in America and you work to very, very long hours on a film set, on American film sets. But the French hours system restricted the working day of film to 10 hours because it didn't require a fixed lunchtime. So catering tables would be laid out, food would be available, so you could go and graze, you could go and eat on the go at any point. But the offset of that was at the end of 10 hours, no matter where you were, you are shutting up shop unless an extreme circumstance, and everyone could just go off and see each other, see their families at the end of the day. There are a couple of night shoots in the midst of it all as well, but always on French hours. And he described the challenge of that. He just says you can do it, you just have to be really organised. And it was only because he was shooting in Budapest in Hungary that he was able to even do it. Now, it ended up in Hungary because of tax breaks. He explained this to Post magazine because he said, I also wanted these glamorous European locations as I'd originally written it as taking part in Paris, Venice and Capri. And once we started scouting, he explained, we realised that Budapest could double for a lot of places. So I just rewrote the script so that most of it happened in Budapest. He also said I did the same thing with The Heat, where Boston originally doubled for New York. And then I just thought, why not set it all in Boston instead? For Feig, the fresh itch that he was scratching was action scenes, which he hadn't really done at this scale before. And he was keen not to heavily storyboard them, but there was some degree of previs work that needed to be done. I'll come to that shortly. He was also worth noting in the midst of all of this that he took a phone call from Ivan Reitman, who had a script for a Ghostbusters film and wondered if Paul Feig would be interested in that. So the first conversations that led to 2016's Ghostbusters with Paul Feig directing took place while he was on set in Hungary on Spy. I will come to Ghostbusters separately in a separate episode of this podcast. But also, the way that Paul Feig was shooting this film was he was getting what was on the page, but he knew he was working with comedic performers. He knew he was working with comedy. And so they were just trying different things, as Melissa McCarthy would explain. The thing about Paul is he's very keen to pump a few bits that aren't in the script in there, little hidden things, and there's a scene at the end, you just go with it. The whole process of him directing goes that way. Everything's on a post-it note, there's new stuff coming in, and it's kind of like organised chaos, it was explained. For certain sequences involving Jason Statham, and I'm really underplaying this, but Jason Statham in Spy, I love the Stath. The Spy is one of my outright favourite Jason Statham films. I just think he's exceptionally well cast and exceptionally funny in it. There's a bit right at the end which I wanted to put a clip in of, which is one of my favourite Statham moments across his career. I won't spoil it for you. But what I can say, and I did ask Paul Feig about, is that on set, Statham was being fed lines pretty much on the spot. That he was going from working on Fast and Furious 7, which he'd been working on as well, which had been a very, very serious and very taxing film for all sorts of reasons. And then he would come to Spy, and at first they were a little bit nervous about just throwing him lines to say on the spot. But then they started throwing him lines on the spot. Again, I'll hand over to Paul Feig and tell you more about that.
So with Jason, I would sit there and I would have these jokes, and then people were handing me jokes, and they were so ridiculous. And I was like, he's going to kill me. Like, at some point, he's going to punch me because these jokes are so stupid. But so I'd just go like, and I'd read it off, and he would like burst out laughing, and then he'd do it. And so we just got so hooked on like, what is the stupidest jokes we can write for him?
And that's why the DVD and Blu-ray releases of Spy have an enormous amount of outtakes, brilliant outtakes. If you find the stuff in the film funny, the stuff that they didn't use is also really quite superb. And they gave themselves the space during the shoot to be able just to try things like that. Now, there was still the action. I mean, there's quite a lot going on in the film. And as Feig would explain to RogerEbert.com, the knife fight sequence that takes place in the film, set in a kitchen, he talked about how his stunt coordinators, JJ Perry and Walter Garcia, got together to previs everything with their stunt team. Then they filmed a version of what it should be, and then they took that to Paul Feig ahead of filming began, so he could add jokes to it, to build on it, and to find the funniest, scariest, most action-packed thing that we could do. What Feig didn't want to do was just have an action scene for the hell of it. So as soon as it was designed, he would just tailor it to the kind of film that he wanted to make. Spy also presented special and visual effects challenges as well. That in the end, there are 12,000, imagine that, 1,200 effect shots in the film. And one of the big challenges is a sequence that takes place on a plane where the plane just starts to go, let's just say, a little bit shonky, and people get a bit weightless in it. And it wasn't something they really had the money to do. And as Feig would tell Post Magazine, that whole weightless plane sequence, we never had the budget for it. It was originally meant to be a much bigger sequence with two Lear jets chasing each other through the Alps. But Feig explained, I shot it so the action was all inside the plane. And then when we began cutting it together, we were able to add some exterior VFX plane shots. And he said, I fell in love with the Dolby Atmos system on post as well. And we designed a lot of things flying around and overhead just to showcase it too. It was a 55-day shoot to those aforementioned working hours, and the whole thing stayed absolutely on schedule as well. But then what this afforded Feig was time in post-production to shape the film and to properly test it. He's a big believer in test screenings, in comedy in particular. He just has talked several times across several movies about why it's so important. He does have a thing about not showing his films to friends and family to get feedback off them because they're just not going to be candid enough. And so what he did was he took the film back to Burbank in Los Angeles, of course, for 6 months of editing work. But within 3 weeks, he had what he would describe as his first screenable cut of the film. Again, going to Post Magazine, he said, Post was quite long as I shoot so much extra material, so we do a lot of versions of the movie. And he says, I'll start test screening 3 or 4 weeks into my director's cut to get a sense of what works and what doesn't. He says, my goal is always to not fall in love with any one cut, which is what happens the longer you work on one cut. So we'll do test screenings every few weeks, pull stuff out and change stuff. And he says the difference with this film is that as it's such a big action film, Fox Post rigged it up so we could have full temp mixes on a stage, as it really needed that scope. And it meant that the versions that they're presenting as well were the kind that you could put in front of a test audience properly. In the end, he tested it. I think it was 10 different test screenings of the film that Spy went through, and across the 6-month edit, it came down to a running time of 120 minutes bang on. That originally the plan from 20th Century Fox was to release it on the Memorial Day weekend in the US. By early 2015, it sort of changed its mind on that and moved it just a week or two back to June the 5th of 2015. But Spy had come together pretty much start to finish once the green light had been given in very, very quick time. And this was 2 years from the point this was going to happen to, in fact, just slightly less than 2 years to it being seen on a cinema screen. It was premiered at the South by Southwest Festival on March the 15th, 2015, and that was nearly 3 months ahead of its proper theatrical release. The critical response to the film was, comedies never really get good reviews, but Spy did. Spy got really quite good reviews. In fact, in some places, really, really excellent reviews as well. Singled out for praise, Jason Statham in his first full-on comedic role. I don't know where you class Crank. I think there's all sorts going on in that. But this was playing very much to comedy and the joy of the face-off machine. If you've seen the film, you know. And so he was praised, as was the dynamic between Melissa McCarthy and Rose Byrne. The fact that McCarthy and Feig clearly worked well together was singled out as well. And the general feeling was this was a funny film, a really good funny film. There were a couple of people who didn't quite buy it, but still, it was generally going into cinemas off the back of positive word of mouth from critics. Now, the title had, of course, changed. Fox decided Spy was a better title than Susan Cooper in the end. It's worth noting as well that Paul Feig went into this when he originally conceived the character of Susan Cooper and the idea of the movie. He had a franchise in mind, that his template was the James Bond movies, and his love for the James Bond movies. And he just thought if he sets this up right, there could be room to do more of these films. Going into cinemas, this had been, at this stage, it was his most expensive film. It was costing $65 million to make. And so, an upgrade on Bridesmaids and The Heat. And so there was a little bit of uncertainty heading into its release. Went into cinemas in the US June the 5th to the 7th, 2015, straight in at number one. $29 million opening weekend. And Paul Feig had a third straight hit on his hands. He was making comedic films headlined by women and also turning them into box office hits. Now, it's not as if it wasn't a competitive week in cinemas that weekend either. That Spy displaced the previous week's number one, San Andreas. I'm coming to that in a future podcast as well. San Andreas made $25.8 million on its second weekend. But also debuting that same weekend was Insidious Chapter 3 in third place with $22 million. There was a rival comedy as well. The thing is, here's a bit of good fortune. It was the terrible Entourage movie, $10.2 million. But given the strength of the TV series behind it, there was a feeling that Entourage might bite into Spy's box office a little bit. Turned out not to be so. The quality of the film, I think, didn't really help it there. It's worth noting too that Love and Mercy, which a really underrated and underseen film, opened in 11th place on 481 screens in the US with $2.1 million. Other films that were around at that point, Mad Max Fury Road was a month into release and remained great. That was in 5th place. Pitch Perfect 2 was sat in 6th. Tomorrowland, coming to that shortly as well. That's in 7th place with, by that point, it made $76 million after 3 weeks on release. Avengers Age of Ultron was the big film around at that point. That was up to $438 million. Cameron Crowe's Aloha, a really interesting film. Again, there's a conversation about that some way down the line we can come to. And The Poltergeist Do-Over was also in the top 10. The following week, it was a competitive summer. Jurassic World roared into cinemas with $208 million opening weekend gross. But Spy held most of its audience, $15.6 million in its second weekend on release. And as much as the big films kept coming, Inside Out was out the following week, Dope was out the following week as well, Spy just hung around in the top 5 for a little bit, even as other comedies popped up. Ted 2 was out. And after Spy was 4 weeks on release, That helped itself to 33 million on its opening weekend, but Spy was still in the top 5, closing in on $100 million gross. Terminator Genisys, Magic Mike XXL, they were coming the week after. And by the time Spy dropped out of the top 10 at the US box office, it had been 6 weekends on release. It was films like Minions and The Gallows and Selfless that knocked it out in the end. By the time it completed its US theatrical run, 110 million in the bank. Not shabby at all. Also, Feig had been open about the fact when he was making the film he wanted to make comedies that travelled overseas as well, and the fact that Spy notched up 124 million outside of the US for an R-rated comedy as well, it was not playing to a broad family audience. Well, the total worldwide gross was 235 million, and that was seen as a result, not least when it did pretty well on home formats as well, and continues to be watched and enjoyed today, really. There was, I should know, I don't know, I couldn't get this double verified, but nonetheless, I'm going to tell you anyway, because it did pop up on 1 or 2 places. There was a slight problem putting it to the American Ratings Board that a prosthetic of someone's nether regions was required. And in order to get the R rating off the American Ratings Board, apparently they had to show the Ratings Board the particular prosthetic, presumably to show them that, I mean, bluntly, it wasn't a real ding-dong. So there you go. Your life is enriched for knowing that, I'm sure. In terms of moving on to Spy 2, I mean, Feig was keen to make it. As I understand it, whenever I cross paths with him, not very often, but whenever he's got a film out interview, I always ask about Spy 2, and he remains keen to do it. It's something that he's interested in. But there have been a couple of things that worked against it. I mean, number one was he was busy. He was straight onto the Ghostbusters film, which came out in 2016. And the other story I heard, which he didn't disagree with, was that Fox in the end had a bit of a choice to make, because that same year, 2014, another spy film had hit big for the studio. That would be Matthew Vaughn's Kingsman: The Secret Service. And by the sounds of it, it came down to a choice from Fox. Does it want a sequel to Spy, or does it want a sequel to Kingsman? And it went with the sequel to Kingsman. Meanwhile, Feig was off doing other things, and then Melissa McCarthy started making comedies with Ben Falcone fairly regularly instead. And her and Paul Feig, as much as there's talk of them working together again, haven't actually worked together on a film since 2016's Ghostbusters. It's been a long time for such a really strong comedy partnership there. Spy sits there. It sits there on Disney Plus at the point this podcast is being recorded, and when people watch it, there's very few people who do not like the film, and it leaves itself so open to further adventures, both for the characters of Melissa McCarthy and Jason Statham. I really hope one day it happens, but in terms of Paul Feig's career, it is my favourite Paul Feig film, but also in terms of the comedies of 2010s, it's a really, really high watermark. And I mean, Jason Statham comfortably, do not say this lightly, in the top 3 Jason Statham films as well. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. I'm going to do some Parish Notices, if that's all right with you. First of all, if you like this podcast and don't mind giving it a bit of a lift, there are 3 ways other than lending it your ears you can do so. I'm very appreciative, I should point out, that you've lent it your ears, so I thank you in the first instance for that. If you want to help us financially, if you go to patreon.com/SimonBrew and put some money in the pot there, you tend to get the podcast early pretty much every week. You certainly get it ad-free as well, and you find out what gossip is going on behind the scenes, the other Film Stories projects that are noodling along to various degrees. So there's a fair amount going on there, and thank you to everyone who supported me there. Costing you absolutely nothing is to subscribe at your podcast home of choice. Thank you so much for doing that. It really helps with algorithms and things I don't understand. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that would be massively, massively appreciated. If you are a nerd like me who loves film magazines, print film magazines, especially big chunky ones, then Film Stories is also a big chunky film magazine. 168 pages every issue on really nice paper as well. Imagine that, just like they used to make. And it's just full of film writing. That we don't tend to do much in the way of superheroes. I mean, other people do that really, really well. There's no point in me competing there. But it's a mainstream film magazine that basically everything else. We talk about independent film. We talk about mainstream film. We dig out stories from the past. You can find the latest issue at store.filmstories.co.uk. And likewise, I do a print magazine for under 15s, the kind of magazine I wished had existed when I was growing up. And it's partly written by them as well, and they get paid for writing, so they get to see that and hopefully appreciate that their writing has value and has worth. It's called Film Junior. We're working on a new issue of that at the moment, but all existing issues are available at store.filmstories.co.uk, and that's also where you can find our Blu-rays. We've done UK exclusive Blu-rays of Sneakers, which is now sold out, I'm afraid, of the brilliant No Way Out, which is not sold out, and the brilliant Bull Durham, which is also not sold out, all at store.filmstories.co.uk. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, I'm on social media. I'm on Blue Sky, actually. I quite like Blue Sky at the moment. I'm at Simon Brew there. I still just about keep my paws in Twitter, whatever it's called at the moment. That's at Simon Brew as well. Film Stories is on there at Film Stories, and also at Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. Over at YouTube, youtube.com/Film Stories. Then you can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew. Our shop is store.filmstories.co.uk, and our website updated every weekday with news, reviews, features across movies, TVs, games. We don't do clickbait, so we do things the difficult way that all the algorithms don't like, so it's your support that keeps us going. You can find us at filmstories.co.uk. Thank you to everyone who helps spread the word about what we do. Now, though, I've of course outstayed my welcome, as I always do. I'm going to leave you in peace. The main thing, as always, is you all stay safe and you all stay well. I'm off to watch another load of movies, and I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, take care, look after yourselves. Bye bye.